Okay, so now what I'd like to talk about is specifically the sympathetic nervous system. Again, as a reminder, that is one of the divisions of the autonomic nervous system, and it is the fight or flight response. Okay, so we're going to talk about structural differences, and then we're also going to talk about functional differences. Okay. So I want to look at actually this page from your textbook. It's on page 539. Okay, and you'll see this is the distribution of sympathetic innervation. So that means the sympathetic nervous system. What does it look like? Okay, just to orient you to this image, the red is going to be the preganglionic neurons and the black is going to be the postganglionic neurons. Okay. So, some things that you should note, okay, is that sympathetic neurons, okay, sympathetic nerves are going to be coming from out of the spinal cord between T1 and L2, okay. So that is sympathetic innervation right here. Now what's going to happen is the preganglionic neurons, they can come out and they're all going to pass through these ganglia. Okay. Now these are the sympathetic chain ganglia that we've talked about before, whenever we were talking in chapter 13 about structures and impulses that are going in and out of the spinal cord. So we talked about this before. Now, something you should know is that sometimes the neurons will synapse, the preganglionic neurons will synapse on the postganglionic neurons in these chain ganglia. Okay. But in other cases, like what we see here, it goes through the ganglia, but it's actually the preganglionic neuron that keeps on going through, and it doesn't synapse on the postganglionic neuron until later. So that's going to happen in these three regions. Okay, we have one called the celiac ganglion, which this is going to be a ganglion outside of these chain ganglion. These chain ganglion lie really close to the vertebral bodies. We're also going to have the superior mesenteric ganglion and the inferior mesenteric ganglion. So these are all ganglion that are not right next to the spinal cord. Okay, sometimes these are called collateral ganglion. Okay, and you may notice that in some of these cases we have a thing called a splanchnic nerve. What that is that is a preganglionic neuron that is passed through the sympathetic chain ganglion without synapsing, and it keeps on going, and it does not synapse until one of these three collateral ganglions. So that makes it a splanchnic nerve. Okay. One thing that you should notice, because we're going to compare this point later, is that the preganglionic neurons, most of the time, they're relatively short, and these black postganglionic neurons are relatively long. Even with the sympathetic chain or these collateral ganglion, the ganglion are pretty far away from all of these effectors. Okay. Another thing to note in this image is the neurotransmitters used. So preganglionic neurons will release acetylcholine, and that will stimulate the postganglionic neurons. But these postganglionic neurons, whenever they get to their effectors, generally they're mostly going to release norepinephrine. Now, if you look back on your homework, okay, the effectors contain different receptors. If they contain these receptors, then they're going to be stimulated by norepinephrine. But if they happen to have alpha 2 or beta 2 effectors, then they're going to have decreased activity. Now, for what the sympathetic nervous system specifically does, these are all of the functions. Okay, so you can read through these yourself. For example, increased sweat gland secretion. Well, that makes a lot of sense. If I'm getting ready to fight or run away, then I probably want to be ready to bring my body temperature down because I'm going to be expending some energy, in my case, probably running away. Okay. And so the other thing to note in this image right here, and let me move this, is that there is one exception that you'll notice here, that this preganglionic neuron will actually come down and directly stimulate the adrenal medulla. And this releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, and that's going to prolong all of the effects of the sympathetic nervous system. So that is also pretty important.